don't shy away from just either questions or comments or criticisms, because sometimes I'm not sure exactly what I've written in here. The other thing, I know that you theoretically, since you're all here, you were, I think, assigned to read the book. But I also remember, I'm not so old that I don't remember my time in high school, in which many assignments I was theoretically assigned to do didn't quite get done. So before I start by reading a section, I just want to kind of, a real quick overview so that we're all on the same page and what I'm reading makes sense. Working in the Shadows is a chronicle of a year I spent doing jobs that are often done by undocumented immigrants. But what I found is in many of the workplaces as well, there's a good mix of US-born and foreign-born workers. And during that year, I began in Yuma, Arizona, which is right near the Mexican border, and I spent a couple months harvesting lettuce for a company called Dole, doing farm work. And then I moved to rural Alabama and worked at a sort of massive chicken slaughterhouse, which was interesting to me because I've been a vegetarian since grade school, and working at a massive chicken slaughterhouse definitely has kept me a vegetarian. And then I went to New York City and worked first at a flower shop. There's this district called the Flower District in Manhattan. And ironically, when I went to the flower, I was thinking of the flower shop after like doing farm work and working at this chicken plant where I'm tearing apart these chickens, and chicken fat is sticking to my face and my chest, and there's blood everywhere. I thought a flower shop would be a great sort of job to do next, and it's also almost all immigrant work. And that turned out to be the hardest job of all. I was fired after 2 days. I was called a happy chicken when they fired me, and I don't have any idea what the guy was talking about. And then after that, I worked at a restaurant in Manhattan. And I'm not sure if it's the same, it's probably not the same in Joliet, probably not as much in Chicago, but in Manhattan, everyone does takeout. And so there's this army of workers who ride bikes through the traffic, through crazy traffic, to bring lunches and dinners to people that they order. And so I did that for a couple months. The section I'm going to read right now is about my time at the poultry plant. The town was called Russellville, Alabama. It was, for many years, like many small towns, for a long time it didn't change. Mostly white, some black. In 1991, there was like 3 Latino students in the entire school district. Now, more than 40% of the kindergarten class is Latino. So there's been a real change in the town. And the change comes about because they built a massive poultry plant. And so I was hired to do that work. The first couple of days at the plant, I was mostly like making boxes or sweeping, doing things that didn't actually get me directly in contact with dead chickens. And again, as a vegetarian, I didn't really know what a dead chicken looked like. But this section that I'm going to read is about the first time that I really sort of get a sense of what it's like to be on the line in this kind of place. And I should mention before I begin that some of the scenes to me were very foreign and kind of like crazy and seemed to have nothing to do with, with where we are here, except that anytime you go to McDonald's or KFC or churches or whatever equivalent you have here, those chickens are coming straight out of places like this. I get my first taste of true line work monotony the following evening when I'm told to stay in DSI. Since DSI deals directly with fresh chicken meat, unlike IQF or the combo department, for the first time I put on the standard plant uniform, a cheap blue plastic smock no thicker than a single piece of paper, a pair of cotton gloves under a pair of plastic ones, and a white hairnet. At this point, DSI remains a mystery. I don't know what the acronym stands for or what it does. I do see 2 lines running parallel to each other, with workers standing on either side. Since keeping workers totally in the dark seems to be part of the business model at Pilgrim's Pride, that was the name of the company I was working for, I'm not surprised when Barbara, my supervisor, tells me to follow her without explanation. We leave the 20 or so other DSI workers and walk up a low platform where another short belt runs at waist level. I'm now standing above the workers. You blank, blank, blank before? Barbara asks. There are words in between that I can't hear. I pull out my earplugs and the noise of the plant rushes in. What's that? I shout. I said, "You ever tear chicken breasts?" She's now shouting too. Not really. Okay, good. Stay here, and when the breasts come by, tear them in half. Tear them in half? With my hands? I turn around in time to see her walking away, and I put my plugs back in. This should be interesting. I stand at the perch for several minutes, waiting nervously for chicken breasts. From this angle, I have a view of a large section of the plant floor, but it's just too complex to make sense of. I realize that while workers are slaving away on the ground, an intricate system of machinery is constantly churning above us. I'm reminded of those plastic marble sets of childhood, in which you placed a marble and followed its progress along a circuitous path until it eventually landed at the bottom. I don't know, I was a kid a long time ago, I don't know if those things still exist, but wherever I look, I see chicken meat flying off belts, spinning around gears, dropping from one moving plane to another. "What's going on, Gabriel?" Kyle ambles up the steps. Kyle was my neighbor. I lived in a trailer right next to the plant. He lived next to me. Kyle ambles up the steps wearing his hooded Alabama sweatshirt. "Looks like we're fixing to be partners." "You know what we're doing here?" "Chicken breasts. You tear them in half, they come to me, and I put them in boxes." Just as Kyle takes a position to my right, the first few chicken breasts begin dropping from about 10 feet in the air. They land on another belt with a plop and travel directly past my station. The breasts are pink, slippery, heart-shaped, and much larger than I expected. A line of sinew connects the two halves of each breast, which is what Kyle says I must tear through. Some rip easily, needing no more strength than what is required to tear through a thin stack of papers. Others are stubborn and take a second effort to separate. For these, I dig my fingers and thumbs deep into the flesh and yank hard. Some, in fact, are connected so strongly by the sinew that I actually tear right through the breast muscle. Tonight, the whole breasts don't give off much of a smell, but each time I tear through the dense muscle, a nauseating whiff of meat is released. For a few minutes, my vegetarian self is aware that this task is pretty gross. A number of the breasts are coated in coagulated purple blood. Others have a film covering the muscle that makes the meat hard to hold, and a few go squirting out of my hands onto the cement floor. Gobs of fat cling to the breasts. The fat is whitish and could easily be confused with scrambled eggs. When I tear the breasts, pieces of fat come flying at me, and within minutes they cover my blue smock. Other pieces are sent sailing at my face, landing on my cheeks and forehead. As disgusting as this task is, it doesn't take very long for a routine to set in. Within an hour, I've torn up the breasts of nearly 1,000 birds that were recently slaughtered, but I'm no longer even thinking about chicken. I'm bored, my wrists are beginning to hurt, my thumbs are locking up. "This sucks," I shout over to Kyle. He grins. "Welcome to Pilgrim's Pride." Breasts have been dropping from above one at a time. Now entire groups are tumbling down. Whole breasts start getting past me, so I use my right arm as a wall to drag back the intact breasts before they get to Kyle. Of course, the time I spend dragging them back is time I'm not tearing them, and it's not long before I've got a massive collection of breasts in front of me that I am, essentially, hugging. A few tumble off the line and land at my feet. I kick them to the ground. As I'm wondering what to do, a woman walks by wearing the blue hairnet of an assistant supervisor. "Hey, we can use some more help," I shout to her. She turns to me. "What?" "We could use some help, I can't keep up." She gives a faint nod and keeps on walking. This is what always happened, by the way. You rarely see these supervisors, when you ask them for help, they kind of wander away as if they have something stuck in their ears. Just let some go, Kyle says. F it if we can't get them all. I assume, being in high school, you understand what that word was. That sounds like a good idea. I remove the barricade my arm has created. Kyle lets hundreds of whole breasts glide past him and into the boxes, which will be delivered to customers whole instead of divided. We fill up a number of boxes before the pace slows and I'm able to regain my rhythm. I glance around furtively, waiting for an outraged supervisor, but no one is watching. Hanging from the break room wall is a framed document. Let me just back up and say, in this chicken plant, there's a big break room. On one wall, I never seen anything else, on one wall of the break room are these signs that say things like, "You can do it, we're all in this together," that no one paid any attention to. On the other wall was a wall of soda machines you could buy. And the third wall was a wall of painkillers that you would go and you would buy, and people are constantly buying painkillers because the pain in your hands is so great. And I remember I asked for an orientation, the woman said, you know, when you start doing this work, your hands and wrists are going to lock up. You're going to be in constant pain, so you should take painkillers every 4 hours. And I asked, do you mean every 4 hours until you get used to the pain? And she said, no, every 4 hours as long as you're working here. So hanging from the break room wall is a framed document reminding us of the 3 cornerstones of continual improvement: quality, process improvement, and teamwork. Out here in the real world of the processing floor, Kyle and I have just demonstrated teamwork in order to reach a process improvement that has completely undermined quality. When you're working in a plant that can slaughter and process more than 250,000 chickens a day, quality just doesn't stand a chance. We worked until 1:45 a.m. I was doing the graveyard shift. Due to the din of the machinery, Barbara communicates that it is break time by holding both hands in front of her chest and miming the breaking of a stick. Kyle and I discard our smocks, which are torn and covered in chicken muck, and toss them in the trash. As a result of my mind roaming over the last hour, I've come to the conclusion that the breasts resemble nothing so much as the rear ends of newborn babies. This is my insight for the day. Later in the shift, I moved to a different part of the line, doing the same work next to a black woman who has been at the plant for 4 months. As we tear breasts, I share this observation. Her response: "You have something wrong in your head." After a few minutes of silently tearing breasts, she comes around. "It does, kind of. The butt of a white baby." So one of the things I took from the book, I think, immediately was I knew getting into these jobs that they would be hard, you know. I didn't realize what that meant. Kyle, my coworker, when we were talking about it, said that these are jobs that make you old quick. And they do, they make you old very quick. In the course of a shift at the chicken plant, a worker, when I was tearing breasts, I would tear more than 7,000 chicken breasts in hand in an 8-hour shift. Another point, I was dumping tubs of frozen chicken breasts into this bucket that then would go down the line. And I calculated that I would do about 30 tons in a shift. But other people had it much worse. The plant, I think not unsimilar to this school, was about maybe 30% black, 30% white, a little more than 30% Latino immigrants, mostly from Mexico and Guatemala. But some of the worst jobs in the plants were given to the immigrants. And one of those jobs is called debone. And on the debone line, you have these chickens flying by you, and you've got a knife. And you're basically cutting each chicken as it goes by. And in the course of a shift, you do that maybe 20,000 times. What happens when you do that 20,000 times is your hands totally fall apart. So I met people they couldn't hold glasses. They had to quit the work. Their hands had become gnarled. I met moms who couldn't actually hold their newborns, carry their newborns, because their hands just weren't functioning. So this was my introduction, I think, to the fact that there is work that's not just hard, but that work that sort of destroys you, sort of systematically, if you do it long enough. The other thing was that the work paid really poorly, as Mark said. So at the chicken plant, I made about $8 an hour when I was working the graveyard shift. Other people, also to make ends meet, worked the daytime shift. So if you imagine at another job, so if you imagine you're working 8 hours at night, 8 hours during the day, and you have kids, well, you're not going to be sleeping very much. And the first week on the job, actually, we had the first sleep casualty where someone was fired for simply falling asleep on the job. It was really amazing to see, because this woman would actually be sitting there doing this line work and just sort of fall asleep for like 15 minutes at a time without falling down. But it sort of spoke to the economic desperation that these folks had. The other thing that I think is important to mention is that I had it so easy when I'm doing these various jobs. You know, I was a relatively healthy 30-year-old. I'd gone to college. I had other options. This was a book project for me. For other people, and my only responsibility was to do the work, come home and take some notes about what had happened and go to sleep. But the people that I was working with, this was not a little project for them. This was their lives. And so they're doing this work while they have kids, while they're coming home from school and having to help their kids with homework, making meals, all the things that go into people's complicated lives. And I think as I was working on this book, I would occasionally talk to my grandparents about how crazy the situations were that I'd seen. And my grandparents had grown up dirt poor in farms in North Dakota and Minnesota, and they kept relating to everything. You know, this is how it was for us. This is, you know. And so I think even though the skin color was different, they were from, Norway and Finland, that it's a reminder that the story of immigration continues, and that the experiences, while they might seem totally foreign nowadays, in fact have a lot in common with what happened. So the backstory of the book, because assuming a bunch of you have read it, I'd like to talk briefly about why the book, how I went about it, and then what was the impact, and then open it up for questions. I don't know if anyone here knows that there's a woman named Amy Goodman who has a program called Democracy Now! It's a radio program, and she has this definition of a journalist. As a journalist, his responsibility is going to where the silence is. So going to where the silence is. Going to find the stories that aren't being covered. Going to interview the people whose voices haven't been heard. We know what celebrities do all the time. And what they shouldn't be doing all the time. We know generally where the president is and what he's saying. But there is a vast world out there that I find incredibly more interesting that we know very little about. And so part of the reason I think I was drawn to this book was that not only are these worlds hidden, there's a reason that chicken plants don't have windows. The companies don't want you to see what's inside, but also that they're so connected. All of us here probably have eaten a Big Mac or some sort of fast food sandwich that has lettuce that was harvested in Yuma by workers like the people I met. All of us have probably, if you eat chicken, I've eaten chicken that came out of the plant that I worked in. So in many ways, I think it's a way to realize these connections that we all have. And to start thinking about, if you're eating products that come out of these places, there may be sometime down the line to start thinking about what sort of responsibilities you might have if those jobs, if that chicken that got you so cheap is destroying people's hands. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that you're responsible, but it might mean that you start thinking more about the sort of connections that are hard to make just in your day-to-day lives. In terms of how I did the book, it's probably a lot like getting an assignment here. You do your research, you try to figure out whatever you can about the topic. So I tried to find as much about immigration, the history of immigration, the types of jobs I was doing, where Latino immigrants in particular are moving, the work they're doing, what are the wages they're generally paid, how dangerous it is. And then read a lot, which I think if there is one thing I did not take away from high school, but that has been really important to me since leaving high school, is reading. I read almost no books in high school, which did not lead to a great high school career. But since leaving high school, I think I've had a much better sense of how, at least for me, how important it is to try to figure out what's going on in the world by reading as much as I can. So what happened from the book? One of the goals was not just to talk about, I have my own biases, which I think come across kind of clear in the book. I think immigrants today, as much as people might talk negatively about them, have a lot more in common with my ancestors that came from different countries but had very much the same experiences. They do surveys of people of how they feel about immigrants, and they've done these for decades, and it's almost always the exact same conclusion. People being asked how they feel about the immigrants in general, they feel not very good at all, very uneasy about the immigrants that are arriving today. They feel much better about the immigrants that came before. They do those surveys in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. In general, people are quite uneasy about what's happening today, but are able to sort of say that the immigrants that came before were somehow better, and that pattern continues. So I think my perspective is one in which immigrants play a generally very positive role, but very unheralded role that we don't often acknowledge. But the point of it wasn't just for me to get on a soapbox and say this is what I think about that, because that's not especially interesting, I don't think, to a bunch of people. But to try to introduce folks to the workers and the work that they depend on every day. Sort of like if you went to the grocery store and you bought an apple. And, when you buy that apple, you think it almost seems like it just popped up there. But when you grab that apple, you're probably the last person to touch that apple was the worker who harvested it. They essentially handed it to you. So it's hard to remember that when you're in the grocery store. So I think part of it was, part of the purpose was to try to make those connections real. The one time it really was great for me was and I meant to like hit this so that I know how my time is, and I didn't. So if it gets long, Mark, you should just say something. But was in Yuma, I did a book reading, which is where I worked in lettuce fields, and I invited a lot of the lettuce crew. And that was the best book reading I've ever done, because usually it's me talking up here, and sometimes I don't say the most interesting things. But here, the lettuce crew actually got up, and I spoke for like a minute to introduce them, and then the whole event was these lettuce workers talking to people in the audience about their work, and I think that was sort of the general point of the book. The other thing that happened was there were like some good policy things. Right after the book came out, the head of OSHA, which keeps track of, is in charge of making sure there are safe workplaces in the United States. He emailed me and he said he'd read the book and they'd gone and revisited the poultry plant where I worked, and they'd fined the company more than $135,000 for exposing workers to things like acid burns and electric shock. So I think that was also positive to me, is that there were some, tangible things that happened. That plant is a little bit safer than it was before. And then finally, this is my conclusion, and then I'll open it up for questions, comments, and criticisms, is that thinking about what came out of the book for me, I had this sense in high school, and then in college as well, this need to figure out what you wanted to do at a young age, and to set down a plan. In 5 years I'm going to do this, in 10 years I'm going to be here. And that and this might be different at this high school. At my high school, there was a lot of pressure on that. It was like, if you don't know what you want to do at 14, you're going to end up in the gutter. If you don't know what you're going to do at 18, you're in the gutter. And one of the experiences I had in this book was, now it's out and I feel nice that it's out, but during the process of writing the book, I had many moments where I had no idea what I was doing. I would go to places like rural Alabama with a New York driver's license, no assurance that someone was going to hire me. Why wouldn't they be suspicious? I was in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a town you can just stumble into. And so I had a lot of anxiety about whether or not the book would turn out, but I knew I wanted to try it. So I think one of the things I would just say about, and this might not resonate with you, but for me is that post-high school, some of the most interesting and kind of exciting things that I've been a part of have been ones where, when I was doing them, I wasn't exactly sure where it was going. And that it felt like it was kind of risky. So I would just encourage people to keep that sort of spark alive, and to the extent that you can figure out what you want to do, and then even if it seems like a risky path, and parents might be saying, well, how are you going to make money doing that, which my parents said a bunch. If it's something you really want to do, try to make it happen. So thank you very much, and I will definitely open it up for questions.
So a round of applause for Mr. Thompson, please. So we'll do the Q&A. When I hand you the mic, remember you're in an audience, and give us your name and the year, and then hit Mr. Thompson with your devastating, wonderful question. So, hey, Kyle, stand up.
Hello, my name is Kyle, and I'm a junior here at Joliet West. Closer? Sorry. All right. My question was, after first-hand experience, working with immigrants and whatnot, what do you believe would be the best way for the U.S. government to reform or work on to improve immigration in the country, for this growing debates?
Yeah. Well, one thing that would be really helpful, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I'd worked as an organizer previously to get into journalism. And I worked mostly with recently arrived Mexican immigrants in Brooklyn. And as I was doing that work, there was this huge debate around immigration. Every couple of years there's one right now. But this was an earlier one, and it was talking about possibility of immigration reform, different ideas about what roles immigrants played, whether they took Americans' jobs, they drove down wages, whether they brought new energy and actually did jobs that other people weren't as interested in doing, and then opened up new jobs out of those jobs. What was amazing to me as I was working as an organizer was that immigrants weren't being included in that. You know, they didn't interview. It was people, politicians and pundits and air-conditioned TV studio audiences in New York and probably Chicago, sort of pontificating about stuff that they didn't have any direct experience in, and they often didn't even bring in the people that were like the subject to the debate. So I think one thing that's a little bit more positive about this round is that there are a lot more avenues for immigrants to actually they're being included in the debate more. But in terms of a policy thing, it's very hard. So here's the general problem, I think, is that, especially coming out of this recession, a lot of the jobs that are being created are really crappy jobs, right? The good jobs that got lost aren't really coming back as much, but the growth, the new jobs that are popping up that when you graduate are going to be all over the place are the ones that pay a wage that makes it very hard to raise a family or have any sense of security. So those jobs need to be fit. Those conditions need to be improved. People at that poultry plant need to be, earning more than $8 an hour and have working conditions where they're not like destroying their hands. As long as a large number of the workers in those plants are undocumented, it's going to be much harder for them to join in efforts to try to improve those industries. And so I think one key piece, and this is not just to help immigrants, but one key piece is to pass some sort of reform that allows a lot of these people to get on a path of some sort of legal residency here. And I say it doesn't just help immigrants because at that poultry plant, which I said there was a mix of U.S. workers and foreign-born workers, immigrant workers, they all are in the same situation. They're all getting paid those wages that are low, and they're going to all need to kind of come together and work together to make the task of improving that industry is vast, is daunting. And I think it's going to be made much more daunting by the fact that bosses can always try to intimidate a certain subset of those workers. So I think immigration reform would be important not just for immigrants, but also for the U.S. citizens that are working in workplaces as they try to make those workplaces a little better.
Who else has a question?
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a junior at Joliet. My question is about your new book that you're writing. What's your new book about, and what research are you doing on it?
So the new book is a biography of a guy named Fred Ross, who I guarantee none of you have ever heard of. But he was an organizer who spent many years organizing Mexican Americans in California. And one of the people that he knocked on the door of this guy, this young 22-year-old in East San Jose, in 1952, and started talking about the importance of organizing. And eventually sort of brought that guy in and trained him for many years. And that person was Cesar Chavez, who went on to found the United Farm Workers. And so this organizer named Fred Ross also trained and mentored a woman named Dolores Huerta, who helped co-found the United Farm Workers as well, who maybe some of you know. And he trained a guy named Marshall Gantz, who ran Obama's 2008 field campaign. But Fred Ross, like many organizers, kind of did his work behind the scenes and has died in the 90s, has been totally forgotten. And so the work is a biography of Fred Ross and his life. And I think partly it's because of my interest in organizing, but it's also trying to, so many organizers, and I would say, organizing is an incredible vocation that I would encourage people to, I never had heard about organizing in high school, but I felt like I was blessed that I got to do it, so I would encourage people to check it out as a very important career. But that so much of the work of the people that slowly make things better, day after day, goes unrecorded. And so this is an attempt kind of to tell the story of this man who spent so many years organizing and who died with little fanfare, but whose sort of the effects of his work keep being felt today.
Hi, I'm Haley. I'm a junior jobs that you had, what would it be?
Oh, man. Well, I think there's two like sort of issues. One was, people say, and maybe some of you have heard this, or maybe some of you kind of feel it, think it's identify with it. I don't, but which is fine. This notion that, well, people are stuck in low-wage jobs, they need to get more education. It's sort of like, well, you're doing that work at that poultry plant. If you want to better your situation, get some more schooling. And I look at it a different way, which is if you work really hard doing work that kind of takes everything out of you, you should be able to live a life that's not one characterized by constant stress, right? And so I think one big thing would just to increase the wages of the workers there. And we're not talking about massive increases. If you go from $8 to $15 an hour, that's something like $16,000 a year to $24,000 a year. That's not living high on the hog. I think that's important. But I also think one of the things that most of the workplaces have in common is that the workers have very little power, right? I mean, they can be hired, they can be fired. If they go and complain about a situation, the manager can say, well, if you don't like it, you can leave. In those instances, it's very hard to try to improve things. So I think another thing that really would have to happen is that in places that organizations of workers are formed so at least they can, just like company management does, just like teachers meeting do, that workers could kind of get together and meet and talk about the issues that are important to them and work together. Because it's really easy to have one person come up and complain and sort of ignore them. It's a lot harder when you have 20 people come up, or 40 people, or 100 people. And I'm sure this is a great high school, but imagine if there was something that really bothered you at the high school. Or there was a teacher that really bothered you for some reason or whatever, or there's some policy, whatever it could be, and you thought it was unjust. And you go, and you have an office hour, and you sit down and you talk to your teacher, or the principal or whatever, and like, how powerful are you in that situation? I mean, not that anyone here would say this, I'm reflecting on my own high school experience here, but, that's really interesting, I'll take in consideration, okay. I'm glad you came here. Doors always open. Well, that's the kind of things that a lot of these companies say, but it's really hard to get things done if people aren't working together. And so I think the other thing about improving these conditions is that you really have to have an organization of workers that's kind of a counterpoint to that, that the companies take seriously.
I'm Sienna. I'm a sophomore. And
Double check.
yeah, and I'm like a lot like you. I write stories, and I do comics and stuff. And I was just wondering how you were able to get it out there, for people to read it, because like writing's always been like a passion for me, and I think it's really cool that you were able to do it. So I'd really like to know how I can put my stuff out there.
Yeah. Well, what I didn't say is that I spent like 10 years, or 8 years writing for basically no pay while I was doing another job as an organizer. Almost all of my assignments for a number of years, and some of them weren't assignments, they were just things I wanted to write. I wrote and got no money out of it, and just kept kind of slogging along. So one of the things that I don't want you to take from it, and I remember hearing talks like this, similar, where someone's talking about a book they've done or whatever, is this notion that they sat down, they said, I want to write a book. They wrote a book and everything went smoothly. I mean, what preceded this was a decade of writing kind of for myself because I had things I thought were important to write about. So I'd say first and foremost, it's to keep writing, right? And slowly sort of refine that. This story, I had written some magazine articles for a magazine called The Nation, and so I'd gotten to know the book editor of their book print, and so through some conversations, and you write a brief proposal that sort of convinces, mostly it was convincing them that I could get these jobs, which I actually was not convinced of, but also BSing at certain points is a very important life skill to get you where you need to go. But the reason that I was able to have those conversations is that I'd spent 10 years sending stuff out, working on articles that kept getting rejected, and occasionally something would be accepted. But that I kept writing regardless, and things started falling. And I think that's another important thing that, looking back on it, I thought like, wow, why is this so frustrating? This is like, everyone else has these things that it's like, you just kind of started writing and things happen immediately. And it would have been nice for someone to tell me early on that that's not how it, rare situations it happens, but mostly it's about keep writing, finding places that might want to, comics and graphics that tell stories through pictures and words are becoming ever more popular. So it's trying to figure out, where might be some places that you can send those to. There might be places that are, and even who edits those places. Maybe you can call them up and say, I'm a high school student, I'm really interested in this. Your publication seems like it might be up my alley. Could we go get lunch and talk about it? That's another thing I realized, is that I thought I had to keep waiting to get invited to stuff. Or sort of wait and see and things would happen to me. And really, what I was amazed by continuously is that if you just kind of put yourself out there, people generally are pretty receptive. I think if someone got an email from you saying you're a high school student doing this, and they'd be like, yes, let's sit down and talk. I don't know if that fully answers, because there's never like there's not like a step-by-step thing that can guarantee it happens, but I think it's a lot of writing what you want, and realizing that potentially a lot of it will be rejected and keep going, and eventually you'll kind of push through.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah, and I'm a sophomore. My question is during the beginning of part 2, I was really interested of when you went to the convention with the white supremacists and racist old men, and I was just wondering, what made you go there, and why did you want to put it down in your journal?
Yeah, well, it was mostly by circumstance. What I only learned about, so I just arrived in Alabama, and I was having this, I didn't know exactly how I was going to get a job, and not only that, I didn't realize how isolated it was, and I only had a bike. I didn't have a car because I was living in New York City, so I'm biking around rural Alabama, where it's like 20 miles to get to the job site to put an application. I arrive all sweaty, and I was getting very anxious about whether or not I'd get work. And I went online, and I don't know, I think I just Google searched like Russellville, and it wasn't even about trying to find racists in the area, but I came across that there was going to be this big convention of this sort of neo-Nazi group. And so I went just because I thought, I didn't have anything better to do, but I was just curious how, what it would be like. Were they going to be openly talking about stuff, or was it coded? I was also interested in that in the information I saw, they weren't identifying blacks as the problem so much anymore, but they're identifying this new influx of Latinos as the next sort of target they had to take on. So I was interested to see how that part of the writing about Russellville is looking at how the town has changed. So I was sort of wanting to sit back and see what was. Two things I think about that were amazing for me. One was they just let me in. Like, I didn't lie. I said I was a journalist writing about immigration and curious to, and so like, oh yes. And I think it's probably because they're like the true believers, and they're looking for anyone that might be able to turn on to their cause. So it's like, oh yes, you love this, and they hand me all this stuff about like, justifications for slavery and all this stuff, and like, oh, and I think they probably thought maybe that was going to be a new adherent to it. But the other thing was that how open it was. I mean, they had politicians, they had state senators in Alabama speaking at these kinds of events. And so it reminded me, Alabama is not, it's not thoroughly racist in every way. In the South, these places are very complicated. In fact, I found incredibly good relations on the plant full of the chicken plant between blacks, whites, and Latinos. But that there still is this kind of vestige of a pretty regressive, crazy political system. And I remember I wrote a piece about that and mentioning specifically that there was a state senator who spoke, and he spoke right after a pastor had given a biblical justification for slavery. And this is not mainstream by any, and he listened to the whole thing. I could see him nodding, you know, and then he stands up and says about how these kind of groups are the great groups that are keeping our country together. I wrote a piece about that for a place, and he had to sort of apologize and say he had no idea what the meeting was about, and he thought it was about bringing people together or whatever. But it was a reminder that that I think especially in areas where, like small towns where the change has been very dramatic, it brings up a lot of issues and the ways in which this old guard can sort of both view African Americans and Latino immigrants as subhuman. And so I included it, I think, because you know I made a point of saying this is not Alabama. You know, this is a section of Alabama that kind of still exists, and I thought it was worth mentioning. Oh, me with a parting word? Well, I mean, my only parting word would be I'm just really grateful to be here and excited that you all came, and I'm hoping that at least maybe half of you or a quarter of you have a book in your future. I didn't think I did when I was in high school, so keep plugging away.
Round of applause for Mr. Thompson, please. And I think if somewhere in between, if you have your own copy, and if you do want like a signature, if you want to line up there and take that upon yourself, and he's got a great story.